Hello CLC students, this is Dr. Bob Remedi, and this video presentation is going through the notes for extinction and evolution. Please note that these are going to be broken up into two parts to make everything a little bit more manageable, so make sure that you do watch both parts. So we begin our discussion by talking about what we mean by extinction. Extinction is the loss of all the members of a population or a species. Now, there have been times where species have gone extinct throughout all of geologic time, and it's certainly the case now. But we're also finding that there are anthropogenic or human-caused reasons for these extinctions to take place as well. And one very common cause for these organisms to become extinct is through the introduction of invasive species. And if you've read the textbook, and hopefully you have, the story the textbook talks about is the island of Guam and the introduction of a snake called the brown tree snake. And here you can see where Guam is in the upper left-hand corner here. So we see the islands that are collectively called Micronesia, close to New Guinea and Australia, and here's the continent of Asia off here. So to kind of orient where we're talking about here, and here's a close-up of that brown tree snake. So the island of Guam is located in the South Pacific, and it's home to many unique species of birds. As we're going to see when we talk about evolution, when an island or an island chain develops, over time slowly you see species that are introduced to the island. And because those species are on the island and they can't mate with other members of the species elsewhere, you see mutations taking place randomly. And when enough time goes on and enough mutations occur in that population, you have brand new species. So the island of Guam was home to many unique species, some of which were only found on Guam, some of which were found only on the surrounding islands. But when the brown tree snake was introduced into the island in the 1950s, many of the species of birds became extinct or were extirpated. And we'll talk about what that term means in a little while. But extirpated means locally extinct. So if you have a population that's found over a long area, if it's extinct in one place, it's been said to be extirpated if there are other members that are elsewhere. And all this happened because of the introduction of that brown tree snake. And here's some of the birds. Now these have been extirpated, so they're no longer found on the island of Guam, but these particular species can be found other places, the Micronesian kingfisher, the rufous fantail, and the Mariana's fruit dove. There are some species of birds that are completely extinct. You can no longer find them at all because of this brown tree snake. So generally, as I mentioned before, when species are introduced into an island, species that fly, like birds and insects and bats, they're going to be introduced because of what we call a sweepstakes event, where something like a storm may have blown them onto the island. We can also see rather unique things happening when storms can move species, like this fish that was called the tsunami fish, or the striped beak fish. So in 2011, there was this huge tsunami in the island of Japan, or one of the islands in Japan, that caused waves to crash onto the island. As the waters retreated, in one area, a fishing boat, about 5 meters long, was washed out into the ocean. And over the course of about a year and a half, that boat made its way east across the Pacific Ocean and landed on the west coast of the United States. Trapped in that boat were a number of species that are only found in shallow water off the coast of Japan, and one of them was the striped beakfish. And when we click on the link here, here are some pictures from the aquarium that identified that this boat, so here's the boat, made its way all the way across the Pacific Ocean. It had some flotation in it so it wouldn't sink. But it was down almost to sea level, and here you can see one of the striped beakfish, and then there were some other species that were in there too. and it kept these fish alive in the boat as it made its way west across the Pacific Ocean. So kind of cool stuff going on there. Okay, so sweepstakes events like that are going to allow species to make their way onto an island. And because those species are isolated from the mainland populations and they can't mate back and forth over a long period of time, if enough mutations accumulate, you're going to end up with new species. And these species on the island of Guam, or wherever this is happening, are going to be different from the species that you would find on the mainland. And we'll talk more about these isolating factors in the second video. So when invasive species like the brown tree snake are introduced into a habitat, in some cases, they're able to outcompete native species and as a result drive them to extinction. And here's what happens. So this tree snake, and it does have some venom in the back teeth. So when it bites a bird, it envenomates the bird and can kill it. But these snakes also like eggs. And because they're tree snake, they're arboreal, they can climb up into the canopy, and they just totally devastated populations of birds there. And here you see a brown tree snake with a trap that's set out to catch them. So they can make their way into the trap, and they bait them with dead mice. And then the snakes aren't smart enough to get out, and you can find the snakes and then dispose of them. So the brown tree snakes began eating Guam's birds in the 1950s when they were first introduced, most likely from the island of Australia, or from the continent of Australia. And as I said, it drove many of these birds to extinction or extirpation because in the short period of time that the birds were exposed to these snakes, because remember, there aren't any other snakes on Guam, the birds weren't able to evolve defenses against the snakes. So, as the story discusses, so how do we protect the birds that are left in Guam? Well, there's now captive breeding programs. So actually, off of the island of Guam, they're trying to raise these birds, eventually to be reintroduced into the island. But there's lots of snakes on the island now. So in order to reduce snakes populations, they've got those live traps set up, but they're also poisoning the snakes using dead mice with glued on poison. And I've got a picture here. Actually, this is a little video. I'm not going to show you the video right now, but I will show you this. You can click on the video. It's not very long. It's pretty cool. But they've actually outfitted helicopters that are able to shoot these packages. And each package has a neonatal mouse that was taken before it was born. And they glue what's essentially a tablet of Tylenol, acetaminophen, which is deadly poison to the snakes. And they put them in these containers, put the containers into something that looks like a cardboard toilet paper tube with the streamer in the end. And the helicopter can shoot 4 of these mice out a second. So as they fly over an area on the island of Guam where they think there's a lot of the snakes, they shoot these out. They fall, the streamers go behind them and kind of retard their fall and then get trapped in the trees. And then they open up. And the snakes are attracted to the mice, and when a snake eats a the snake is going to die. And they do this intentionally because they don't want the mice to make their way into the forest floor where they could kill lizards and ground-dwelling birds and critters like that. So in order to try to get rid of those brown tree snakes, they've been pretty unique in the way that they're doing that. All right, so this leads us to some common causes of extinction. So the acronym that we use to describe the anthropogenic causes of extinction, we say is CHIPO. The C in CHIPO stands for climate change, or the anthropogenic or human-caused climate change. The H stands for habitat destruction. The I stands for invasive species like the brown tree snake. The first P stands for pollution. The second P stands for population of humans. And the O stands for overharvesting. Now this information, the human causes of extinction or CHIPO, does represent a possible essay question. So make sure that you are studying this for the next test. You may have noticed that when I say something is an essay question, you do see information on it, either in essay form or in fill in the blank and multiple choice questions. So make sure that you're studying and you're able to list and explain the common anthropogenic causes of extinction. And the mnemonic that we use for this is CHIPO. So let's talk about each one of these. And the first one we're going to talk about is climate change. We will spend a little bit later on in the semester an entire day talking, and actually it might even be almost a week, talking about climate change. So this refers to change in climate patterns due to both natural and anthropogenic causes. We will be focusing pretty heavily on the things that humans are doing in order to make this worse, such as through the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in things like when we burn fossil fuels. Now, in many cases, this is going to end up in a warming of the climate. In a few small areas, it actually makes it cooler. That's why we prefer the term climate change as opposed to the old-fashioned term, which is global warming. And in fact, climate change can hurt some species. And a really good example of this is a salamander that I have caught before, the Weller's salamander, or Plethodon welleri. Now, this particular salamander can only be found near the tops of 4 mountains in Virginia and Georgia. And what probably happened was these were probably a little bit more northern of species, or the ancestor was a little bit more northern of a species. And as the last ice age moved south into Georgia and North Carolina and Virginia, it cooled the climate down. So these salamanders were able to migrate south when that happened. When the ice age was over and the glaciers moved back north, these species, the Weller salamander and its ancestors that preferred cooler climates, were out of luck because it's generally warmer in the south. So most of them died off, except for a few of them that were at the top of these 4 mountains. I think I said Georgia, I meant North Carolina. So Virginia and North Carolina, they were stranded on the top of these mountains because, remember, as you go up in elevation in a mountain, it gets cooler. So these species were only at the top of these 4 mountains in Virginia and North Carolina. Well, what's happening as the climate gets warmer? The temperature keeps going up and up and up, so the top of the mountain keeps getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And our fear is that if climate change continues too much, the temperature at the top of the mountain is going to be so warm that these beautiful species of salamanders will not be able to survive. The H in CHIPO stands for habitat destruction. So natural habitats are being destroyed and converted into human use for things like farms and houses and strip malls and as a place to dump our wastes, because people in Lake County, Illinois produce an awful lot of waste. Here you see a housing development that is being built and how absolutely devastating it is to a habitat, right? So here's property, and they ended up building a house on this shortly after I took this picture. But look, any vegetation that's been growing here has been completely stripped away. And in fact, many builders, when they go and build a development like this, they'll actually remove the top couple feet of topsoil, because good, rich Midwest topsoil is great for growing stuff. And then they'll bag it and sell it. And what we're left with is this low quality soil that's rich in clay, which it's not all that great if you want to have a garden or a lawn or anything like that. So we're destroying the habitat by destroying habitat in order to allow for, these houses and farms and strip malls and such. By the way, this is an important thing to remember, hint, hint, hint. Habitat destruction is the most important reason for the loss of biodiversity on Earth. It's a little something to keep in mind. And how bad is habitat destruction here? So here we see Google Earth picture of the area around College of Lake County here. Let's put it in the middle. So these satellite images were probably taken in the summertime because there's lots of really good green stuff here. But look what we see. We've got green areas. This is Rollins Savannah, which is just a little north and west of the college. And we've got some housing developments that have some green areas, and we've got Gages Lake over here and some green areas around it. But there's lots of buildings and development around. So we don't have large green areas that we can have lots of organisms growing. We've got our natural spaces kind of broken up into segments, and that can be a problem. Because habitat destruction sometimes leaves some habitat. And people say, well, you know, we've got these nice forest preserves, which we do. Lake County has some beautiful forest preserves. And we've got green areas in the residential neighborhoods. Why is this bad for habitat for native organisms? And that's because habitat fragmentation is splitting up these areas into smaller pieces. And what you end up with is you have a lot of edge habitat that's, you know, marginal at best for some species. Many species can't live in the edge habitat around an area that's been broken up. Now, that's not the case for all organisms, because this little guy right here, I took this picture in my backyard on a very, very hot day. This gray squirrel was enjoying just kind of laying down on my deck. Animals like the gray squirrel and the American robin do really well in edge areas. But organisms that have, say, a big home range or have big habitat requirements, like the red fox, which I also took this picture in my backyard, they don't do real well with edge. They need nice, big, native areas without a lot of edge in it. So another way of looking at it is, let's say we've got this nice, high-quality habitat here with high species diversity. Remember we talked about that? And then the area around it is going to be our edge, and that's going to be generally considered a low-quality habitat. Well, if we do something as simple as put a road north to south and a road east to west through our high-quality habitat, look what happens. We end up with a lot more edge and a lot less of the high-quality habitat. Even though the road doesn't take up an awful lot of area, putting them in can be pretty damaging to the amount of our high quality habitat there. So breaking up large quality habitat reduces the amount of high quality habitats needed by many species, like these white-tailed deer here. They need nice big areas that they can use to forage for food. All right, the next cause of human-caused extinction is the I in SHPO, which is invasive species. Sometimes they're called non-natives, sometimes they're called aliens, sometimes they're called exotics. But these are species that are brought to other habitats, or from other habitats to new ones. And they occupy the niches of native species. In many cases, the local predators aren't evolved or haven't evolved in order to keep these invasive species down. And the invasives, in some cases, can actually drive native species out to extinction. And we talked about this with the brown tree snake and the birds in Guam. Another kind of gruesome but kind of cool at the same time example of this is the sea lamprey. Now, when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened up the Great Lakes to the ocean, ocean-going species like the sea lamprey were able to make their way into the Great Lakes. And as you see, this is a very primitive fish. It's what we call a jawless fish. It doesn't have a lower jaw. All it has is this upper jaw. And look at these rows of teeth. And if you look down the esophagus here, this would be going down its digestive tract. This is its tongue, and look, it actually has teeth on its tongue. So this fish will swim up to another fish like a lake trout or some other big Great Lakes species. It will use its teeth to latch onto the side of a fish, and then it will use its tongue with the teeth on it to kind of bore a hole in a fish and suck out its juices. And this is a steelhead trout that had relatively recently a sea lamprey latched on. Kind of neat, huh? Here's another not so neat example. Maybe you've heard of the emerald ash borer. It's, believe it or not, it's actually a real pretty iridescent green beetle, really, really small. But when you have hundreds or thousands of these growing on our native ash trees, now the emerald ash borer was brought in from Asia. The emerald ash borer bores into the ash trees, and as it eats away at the living tissue that's just below the bark, you can have these teeny tiny little beetles killing big, gorgeous ash trees. And the picture that you see over here, this is of an ash tree that died on my property. And you can see where the emerald ash borer actually bored away through the living wood. So here's the bark. I had to peel off the bark so that you could see the living tree tissue right below it. And as thousands of these emerald ash borers ate their way through the living tissue of the tree died. And I lost 4 or 5 really beautiful ash trees because of it. But it's not just emerald ash borer. This is a picture of a tree that I took out in Virginia called the eastern hemlock tree, which is a gymnosperm. It's kind of similar to a pine tree. And this particular tree was 650 years old, they estimated. Another insect from Asia, the hemlock woolly adelgid, was introduced onto populations of the hemlocks. And here you can see kind of the scaly white stuff represents the form that these teeny tiny little bugs, insects, make in the summertime as they're growing. Out of these emerge the bugs. And this 650-year-old hemlock tree that would take 2 or 3 people stretching their arms out wide to go around, the last time I went to go visit this tree, the tree had died. So these invasive species are just wreaking havoc with native species. The first P in CHIPO is for pollution. And what do we mean by pollution? Pollution is doing something to a habitat to make it either less desirable or actually in some cases harmful. We'll be talking about air pollution, we'll be talking about water pollution a little later on in the semester, but there's many different types. So we've got pollution from chemicals like PCBs, which stands for polychlorinated biphenyls. We've got heavy metals like lead and mercury, radioactive materials. All of these chemicals can be pollutants. You can have waste like plastics, and we're dumping plastics into the environment at a rate that's just staggering and causing some serious problems there. Interestingly enough, we can actually have what's called temperature pollution. So when there's power plants that heat water into steam, and the steam is used to turn a turbine, how do you get rid of that hot water? Well, they dump that hot water into lakes and rivers and streams and such, and that actually raises the temperature of the water. And what we'll find out later in the semester is that as you raise the temperature of water, water can hold less oxygen. And if there isn't enough oxygen in the water, all the fish and the other organisms there can die. The second P in CHIPO stands for the human population. So as human populations increased, we need more resources. So you got to have the metals and the plastics for your new cell phone. We need to grow food. We need to get rid of our wastes. And all of this is going to come from natural habitats. And when we make a new farm, or when we dig a new mine in order to get the raw materials, we're going to be displacing native organisms there. And the O in CHIPO stands for over-harvesting, or collecting native organisms at a rate that is higher than they would be able to replace themselves. And we might do this because we're using those organisms for food. We might be using these organisms for medicine. There are lots of examples of people going out and collecting animals, and to some degree plants, for the pet trade. A good example of an organism that was overharvested was the passenger pigeon. And here you can see a stuffed example of a passenger pigeon because they are now completely extinct. There are stories of flocks of passenger pigeons in the early United States. So, think late 1700s. There was a flock that was documented that took over an hour to fly overhead. How many birds must there be for them to continue flying for an hour? Think of it in the millions. And these birds, because they were easy to kill, they were shot for feathers, for hats. They were ground up and made into dog food. They were harvested unbelievably because people thought there were so many of them that it will be okay. And well, the last passenger pigeon died just a little over 100 years ago, and there are no more left. Many species of marine fish are used for the pet trade. So, clownfish, for instance, after the popularity of Finding Nemo, people will go and collect clownfish and other fishes and corals and other organisms, and you got to be careful with that. Interesting story is a plant called the Pacific yew. So a yew tree is another gymnosperm. You can see here's its kind of needles, but it produces these rather interesting fruits. It grows as a shrubby bush, and here you can see the distribution in California, Oregon, and Washington State, and then up into Canada. So you're not seeing, and here's a few in Idaho. So it's not a huge population. But in the early 1990s, it was discovered that a chemical in the Pacific yew called Taxol could be used to treat some forms of breast cancer. Well, when this was advertised, people were going out into the wilds of the Pacific Northwest in the hopes of finding some of these Pacific yew trees and harvesting them and using them for Taxol. The species almost became extinct because people had collected so many of them. Fortunately, they were able to figure out how to manufacture Taxol in a chemistry lab. But if that wouldn't have happened, it's quite possible the Pacific yew could have disappeared forever, and then there would have been no Taxol for making or for treating breast cancer. All right, so how do we identify the health of a particular species? If a species is threatened, then we say it's likely to become endangered in the near future. So there's problems. It might be with overharvesting. It might be due to habitat loss, but the population isn't as big as it once was. An endangered species is a species that is at a high risk of becoming extinct. If a species is extirpated, we talked about this term a little earlier, that means especially if you've got a population that's found over a big area, it is extinct in one area, but there are other populations that exist. And then extinct, once it's extinct, it is gone and it is not coming back. It is estimated that somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of all species that are alive today could become extinct in our lifetime by the 2050s if something doesn't slow the extinction rate, like this machine here, which is used for cutting and harvesting wood. Why is this a problem? Why do we care about extinction? Well, remember, changing one part of a food web affects many of the other parts. Good example of this is honeybees. Back in 2010, which is the latest number I could find, honeybees pollinated around $19.2 billion worth of crops just in the United States. So there's actually a problem with honeybees called colony collapse disorder, and the population of honeybees is going down pretty dramatically. What happens if we run out of honeybees and they stop pollinating plants? Like the bumblebee that you see there on a purple coneflower. If you get rid of the bees, there will be no more seeds, no more fruits, or no new plants that we could use for food or for cotton or for the other products that we get from plants. So what can we do about this increase in extinction rate? Well, number one, there's still a lot of species out there, especially the little critters, that we don't know about. So collecting and identifying critters so we can document what's out there, and by knowing what's there, hopefully prevent their loss. We can also protect endangered and threatened species. And in 1973, a law called the Endangered Species Act was enacted in order to help protect species. The problem is that most of the money from the Endangered Species Act goes to protecting the big vertebrates like bears and bald eagles and the cute and cuddly species. And as a result, some of the smaller, less cuddly creatures are not getting the funding in order to be protected. What can you do specifically to help decrease extinction rate? Well, stop buying products made from endangered or threatened species. So here we see a picture from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service of ivory that's taken from the tusks of elephants that was illegally brought into the United States. And you can see some of them are very ornately carved. And some of this was probably brought in by people that didn't realize it was ivory and that elephants are protected. But these are collected and this ivory is then burned so that we're reducing the market for ivory. Here's another example, also collected by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. People from China were importing. These are actual tiger parts that are used for food, and tigers are endangered, and there is some misconceptions out there that if you eat a part of a tiger that you are then imbued with those tiger qualities, and there is no evidence that that in fact works. So that ends our discussion on extinction. Please stay tuned for part 2, where we will talk about evolution and how these two are related. Thanks for your time, folks. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you around.